Good afternoon, ji. I have planned this special lecture series, and I will try to cover and discuss topics which generally we don't discuss in classes, nearly all academies and teachers, because of a shortage of time, and maybe we don't consider such topics as worth mentioning and worth reading. This particular session, I'm taking it here on Facebook, and from the next week we will inshallah make our YouTube channel, and from that channel we're going to deliver lectures. Today's topic is political economy of development. It's very much relevant to essays, IR, even political science, interviews. You can contextualize such a topic even with BRI and most recent economic dimensions. Next Friday, we'll talk about gender and governance, particularly in South Asian context. Now, as far as this particular topic today, political economy of development, now it's a known fact that for development you need capita. Capita may be in the form of goods, services, you know, and this capita is generally generated out of economic productivity within a society. In addition to economic productivity, trade. So we'll try to figure out that how this economic productivity, the journey of this economic productivity, particularly in the last 300 to 400 years, we'll try to figure out how trade leads to development. But in addition to economic productivity and trade, there are other few tools to generate capital, and that is loan. In addition to loan, it is foreign aid. Foreign aid not necessarily from any state, but as well as private aid. So in this context, before starting our points, it is pertinent to mention that there is a huge gap in context of development the world over. There are few statistics which is very much pertinent to write down these statistics, which would clearly exhibit that few regions across the globe are far better off than the others. For instance, the gross national income, global gross national income, the per capita. The world per capita gross national income is 12,000 US dollars average. And if we figure out this per capita GNI in different continents, so you would come across that the North American region has a per capita GNI of nearly 50,000, and Europe has a per capita GNI of approximately 30,000. South America has a per capita GNI of 8,500 only. Asia has a per capita GNI of 7,500 only. And when you move towards Africa, it's only 1,900 per capita GNI. Only 1,900. So we compare the per capita gross national income of African continent to that of North American continent. So it's a difference of 40 times. It is more than at the wake of colonization of Africa and Asia. So all the development theses since last 100 odd years, it has miserably failed to bridge that gap of development. So we'll try to figure out that how development, the political economy of development, it served global north, global west, and how global west and global north exploited the resources of global south. So in this context, we'll divide our debate, this presentation in three categories. The first one, that is before world wars. Second one, economic and political development before world wars. Second one is during Cold War. And the third one, contemporary, post-Cold War. Basically, we'll just try to highlight certain aspects of so-called political and economic development thesis prior to world wars, during Cold War. Our more focus would be on the dying days of Cold War and post-Cold War. As far as development is concerned, so it's a common sense argument, a very generic argument, that a state, a country would prosper, would grow if the capita in the form of goods, in the form of services, in the form of money is generated within that society. And if capita is flowing out of the state, then it means that chances of development are less. So when we'll try to highlight the salient aspects of economic and political development, particularly prior to world wars, so basically we are critical towards highlighting those aspects or the characteristics through which capita flow out of developing world. And in that context, the most important thing to understand, particularly before world wars, is the idea of colonialism. Idea of colonialism. Colonialism is a complete political, economic, social system. It's a complete package. The essential idea of colonialism is that a colonial power, of course, from the global West, from global North, that power would acquire a territory, let's say in Africa and Asia. They would try to rule that territory, and the ultimate goal is to drain the capita of the colonized territory, and that capita would serve the master country. So it's a complete social, political, and economic system. There are a number of case studies pertaining to colonialism, like the way British did in India. A rough cost estimate of more than 200 trillion of resources were drained out of India. But the most important aspect, which we'll try to figure out today, was the triangular trade during colonialism, particularly in from 1600 to 1800 AD. In those 200 years, slave trade was used. The colonizers used to move African people and they treat them as slaves. They used to sell them in new land, and from new land was bound to produce cash crops. And all the raw material would serve the industry of colonizer, produced finished farm products from the master country would then be sent to new land and other markets. So in a way, through this triangular trade, all the capita would flow towards the master country. This triangular trade is considered as one of the most important reasons behind industrialization of UK. Second aspect, since after 1800, slowly and gradually, Europe as well as New World banned slavery. So the quest or the race towards new territories, it, it, it became a race towards Asia and race towards Africa between the European countries. And this idea of race to drain the resources of African and Asian territories, it virtually resulted into a settlement, an agreement. Berlin Conference 1884. Now the Berlin Conference 1884, it suggests that the European nations officially divided the continent of Africa among themselves, irrespective of the respect to their tribes and their cultures. You would come across straight lines in bulk of the Africa. And isn't it astonishing that a country like Belgium, it nearly colonized 1/4 of the African continent. So it's 75 times more than the territory of Belgium itself. So prior to 1800, the idea of draining the resources or the capita towards the master country was largely triangular trade. And after 1800, it was direct colonization. Bulk of the territory of Africa and Asia succumbed to this second idea. Now, what were the consequences then of such a colonialism? There are lot of readings and material on this issue. The most important aspect, definitely, that the core, the developed world core, exploited peripheries. Peripheries means colonized territories. Number one, in this context, the consequences of colonialism. The first point, that the core countries never tried to create versatility, economic versatility in peripheries, because they wanted their own industry to flourish. So focus was very much on cash crops, since Asian and African territories were largely agrarian, and people are forced to purchase only the products of their master country. Heavy checks were introduced to stop the process of industrialization, just like in the case of India. And even the indigenous resources were exploited, and in few cases, even the indigenous resources were ousted out of the system just to facilitate their own factories. It resulted into extreme poverty, hunger. The famines of Africa and Asia, particularly of late 19th century, are not hidden to anyone. They are well known. Second point, for in order to have this smooth transfer of capital and resources toward the master country, it was pertinent to hijack the mind of the colonized territory. So the colonizers, particularly the French and the British, they introduced or they owned the idea of Kaplan, famous English scholar, writer, Kipling, that was white man's burden. We will acculture these people, they are ignorant. We will civilize them. So even Christianity was propagated. So the exploitation, the process of exploitation was conducted under the garb of this acculturation and this civilizing mission. Of course, that was also a consequence. What happened to this acculturation? That people started adopting Western ideas non-materially and Western values materially. So the dependency of that particular colonized territory, further one can witness the deficit in terms of trade in that particular territory. Their reliance on the products of the master country, because now we are civilized. Third aspect in this context, that generally the colonizers, they would give you this opinion that we started the process of development through infrastructure. We established railroads, We developed road connectivities which were not there in that colonial territory, either in Asia, either in Africa. So yes, definitely, roads, shipyards, railways, and even in some cases, they developed certain modern cities. But that was not for the purpose of development of that colonial territory, but rather the smooth transition of goods, of material to the ports and from there to the master country. Now the question arises, how come a small country of Europe like Belgium, like UK, they colonized more than half of the world? And other, of course, colonizers like Dutch and stuff like that. How come? So the method of colonization, scholarship says that there are two methods which were used by colonizers to govern those vast territories with abundance of labor and people, and they colonizers were very few in number, but yet they managed to not only colonize but as well as rule. The two process which are generally scholarships have highlighted, the direct rule and the indirect rule. Direct rule with the help of a strong bureaucratic system and a strong army. Indirect rule by adopting the strategy of patron-client relationship. That was generally can be witnessed in rural areas of a colony and in the urban areas of the colony through an organized bureaucracy and army. But slowly and gradually, this whole system of colonialism, and from the Marxist perspective, they also label it imperialism. This process of colonialism, it broke down. And now we'll try to figure out how this process you can say broke up. Now, the race towards Africa and Asia engaged Europeans into a competitive, or Europeans witnessed themselves into a competitive environment whereby all European powers would try to colonize. And it resulted into a debate of haves and have-nots. Most importantly, the example of Germans. Germans will literally have no colony at all, except one or two in Africa. So they started challenging the so-called balance of power of Europe. And this challenge leads towards World War I, and simultaneously the same structure led towards World War II. The competitive environment was not only, as the books suggest, that was confined to Europeans. This competitive environment of colonization can be witnessed in the case of China and Japan as well. So all around there was a competitive environment. And you would come across that during World War II, even there were ideological differences among states, those who are known as allied forces. But all those allied forces, they join hands against those who were their competitors. Appropriate the acquisition of colonization of colonial territory, how to acquire the territory, or the competition of acquiring a territory. World War I and most importantly World War II have a disastrous consequence, and virtually after the World War II, a systematic process of decolonization was witnessed. The story doesn't end here. Now moving towards the second phase. The second phase, that global capita, or the flow of global capita after World War II, or you can say political and economic ideas of political and economic development after World War II. There are 7 salient features from the Western perspective, and then we'll go towards the Eastern perspective as well, because it's the phase of Cold War. So there are 7 features from the Western side and 6 features from the Eastern side. But the nutshell argument is that even during Cold War, both the players, the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc, both blocs didn't abandon the same connectivity which was being experienced prior to decolonization. So that's something very interesting. So we'll come towards the rebuilding of West, that how West was rebuilt. The first point in this context was that in the post-World War II era, particularly the start, of Cold War, although Cold War proper, you can say it started with the Truman Doctrine, when properly Americans engaged in themselves in world politics. However, the responsible role of Americans in context of economic development started in 1944. Through 1944, a series of agreements with the agenda how to industrialize world, how to connect world. Once again, that resulted into series of agreements popularly known as Bretton Woods agreements of 1944. So the organizers of Bretton Woods, they believe that unless and until a liberal economic pattern would not be introduced, it is out of question to industrialize world. So more and more economic liberalism is required. And they were very right, because prior to World War, globe was divided in certain blocks, not in ideological context, but in monopoly capitalist context. So they were very much right. But yes, there will be more and more free flowing of capita. The more the capita would flow in and out of a country, it would definitely result into more and more development. There were 3 basic tasks associated with this idea. But in our context, one task is sufficient to understand this whole domain, and that was stabilizing all national currencies. If you would stable all national currencies, so then free movement of goods and trade would be effective. Now, how to stabilize all currencies? Although, even before this idea of Bretton Woods model, gold was used as an international exchange. However, even in 1920s, British and French, uh, they disagreed over certain uh, trade policies, and the recession of 1921 also uh, have a profound impact on these trade regulations. So it was decided that gold as a metal, as a precious metal, would be an international standard, and gold will be pegged in terms of dollar. And at that time, the rate which was set was $35 to 1 troy ounce, TROY, troy. $35 to 1 troy ounce, OUNCE. It was a very good idea. Up till that time, we know today that it was not a good idea, but at that time it was a very good idea. That it would stabilize currencies, dollar would be pegged to US dollar, all would trade in an amicable context, there would be no barriers. However, this whole idea collapsed in 1971. We will discuss it later. But other aspects of this rebuilding of the industrialized world, will come to that later. In this context, if a state has less reserves of gold, then who would help that state? Of course, there would be deficit in terms of trade for that state. So who would gonna help that state? So keeping in view this thing, in the same Bretton Woods model, an institution was established, popularly known as International Monetary Fund. However, the role of International Monetary Fund from 1944 till 1971, it's not, IMF didn't play a significant role. It did play significant role after 71, but that's another debate. We'll come to it. But for initially, we are highlighting the salient features. Now, in addition to this, development is not all about trade. No, it's also about economic productivity. You need infrastructure. You need industry. So this aspect compelled the negotiators at Bretton Woods to come up with another idea, popularly known as World Bank Group, or today we call it World Bank. To pour in either the money or the services to enhance the capacity of those which have been badly hampered in the process of World War. So up till that time, it was one of the most landmark ideas of economic connectivity, of free flow of the global capital, and of course your currencies would also be stable in context of gold. The trade regulations or the issues pertaining to trade were regularized later on through GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which later on became WTO in 1995. But interestingly, although the advocates of this whole model believed in no monopoly, but still the impact of Cold War can be witnessed. The Western group has more decision-making power within IMF, within World Bank. So more privileges and leverages were provided to those who were pro-West. Now I'll come towards the other side of the debate in the post-World War II era, popularly known as Cold War era. And that is, you can say, Cold War politics. The other camp, the Russian camp, later on revolution was witnessed in China. So Russia and China camp. And the other socialist states, they either were not happy, contented towards this whole model of development, or they were not allowed to join this model of development. You may be a socialist, or you may be a capitalist, or whatsoever argument you can take. Now, this Eastern Bloc since 1950s was very critical, and they were of the view that such a design of flow of capital is only between those countries who are like-minded. The exploitation of the periphery has not been addressed. For instance, Marshall Plan invested nearly 17 billion US dollars from 1948 till 1954 only in Western Europe. So what about the peripheries? They never fully integrated into this system. No doubt, Bretton Woods model ushered a new era of open market, free trade, and US assumed the charge of a new global leader. But the plight of the peripheries remained the same. For instance, United Nations Development Decade, first decade of 1960s, when it ended, the GNI of the third world countries further decreased. So this Eastern camp was critical that the idea of development through the forum of UNDP, popularly known as economic dualism, has further drained the resources of peripheries, the least developed countries. And then, unfortunately, the politics of Cold War, either through CIA or KGB, had resulted into undemocratic tendencies prevalent in nearly whole of the across the least developed countries and developing countries largely. Aggressive, ruthless dictators were desirable for the execution of policies of communism as well as for the execution of policies of capitalism. Development without democracy is a fool's hope. Now, you may uh, confront this idea that what type of democracy? Either liberal democracy or meritocratic democracy, whatsoever. But one thing is clear, that development without democracy and human rights is not possible. You would come across a number of new books, how democracies die, then human rights and democracy, then development and democracy. A number of authors have highlighted this issue. It's a settled fact now that development without democracy and human rights, it's not possible. So the Cold War, the impact of Cold War, the strategies of Global West and the strategies of Global East further created problems for least developed countries or developing countries. However, the end of Cold War or the post-Cold War era witnessed certain changes. And these changes, the glimpses of these changes can even be witnessed in 1970s, when Cold War as an international system started fading away. So in this context, the patterns of global flow of capita witnessed certain new dynamics. Number one, rise of Asia Pacific, systematic slow rise of Asia Pacific ASEAN group. Second, Japan, Germany in 1970s, they were again on track. In addition to that, the political tension between USSR and US through developments like detente, like SALT I, then recognition of China in 1970s. So the trade pattern which was set for a pro-mind expanded. And most importantly, the impact of technology and internet, In this context, since global flow of capita was increasing, and it was a worrisome sign for Americans, because prior to the collapse of Bretton Woods model in 70s, the general understanding was that if you have dollars, then you can go to Americans, give them your dollars, and take your gold. That's how it would work. But what Americans realized, owing to this massive flow of capital of all these players in 1970s, that it's not workable now. Dollar in foreign banks and international market, Americans are not capable enough at that time that they can pay gold to everyone. So in 1970s, Bretton Woods model collapsed. And the system of floating exchange rate of currencies was adopted with dollar as an international currency. This floating exchange rate is still prevalent in our system today. Now, make it very much clear in your mind that now it's not about gold which you possess. It's all about the dollar which you possess. So, what happened? That the least developed countries and the developing countries, they need dollars because their trade deficits are now piling up. And who would come for their help now? Definitely IMF. In the post-Bretton Woods model era, IMF emerged as a real power in global economic system. Piles and piles of loans were granted to developing world and least developed world. Even in the case of Pakistan, you can search it online or in books that it's about $500 million that Pakistan took loan prior to the collapse of Bretton Woods model. And in 1970s, Pakistan took more than $500 million. So in the previous 25 years, we took only 500 million and even less than 500 million. It's about 450 something. And in 1970s, after the collapse of Bretton Woods model, even a country like Pakistan had to take more than $500 million. So imagine the plight of the other least developed countries. Now the question arises, why did these least developed countries and developing countries, they took these loans? Why? It's up to 5% that the developing and least developed countries, they took loans from IMF, up to 5%. With the expectation, and it was very much a genuine argument, with the expectation, because in early 70s, the inflation rate, global inflation rate was nearly 6%. So by the time we will pay our loan with this inflation rate, and the interest rate is less than the inflation rate, we will virtually paying back nothing. The more your inflation rate would go, and the less your interest rate as according to inflation rate. So after a certain lapse of 10 to 15 years, the amount you are paying back, it has no significance at all. So it was a very lucrative package for least developed and developing countries. But unfortunately, what happened? That owing to the recession of 1979, global crisis, global financial crisis, owing to European integration in 1980s, owing to the arrival of Chinese in global financial market, and number of other players. What happened that in 1980s, inflation rate lowered down and interest rate witnessed a peak. So you have to pay. In addition to that, the recession compelled most developed countries to restrict their trade with developing world. They have to subsidize their own agrarian economy, agriculture, and the agrarian economy of least developed countries witnessed virtually no buyer at all because least developed countries tried to protect their own economy. So if you would not sell your products, you will not get dollar. And if you will not get dollar, how come you will pay loan? So in 1980s, least developed countries and developing countries have to take more loan in order to pay back the interest rates. So this is how they were trapped. Now, in this context, global West and the Western economists believed that if developing world and the least developed world would bankrupt itself, then what would happen to our loan? So late 80s witnessed two important developments on the part of IMF, popularly known as structural adjustment programs, and on the part of World Bank, known as conditionality and comparative advantage. So these two institutions came up with a new idea so that there must not be any bankruptcy and the connectivity of economic dualism would remain the same. So first now we will try to explore how come World Bank tried to protect this economic system and whether it served the idea of development in peripheries, matlab in developing countries, least developed countries. But certainly up till now, the idea of development didn't witness a success by large. No doubt in social sciences or even in economics or in political economy, no doubt, one factor is not sufficient to analyze. There are a number of other factors as well, like absence of democracy, corruption, bad governance in least developed and third world countries. But simultaneously, in social sciences, in economics, in political economy, there always been one dominant factor. In this case, of course, this financial crisis of 1979 is a major reason. Now we'll come towards that how World Bank and IMF tried to still try to consolidate this idea. And parallel, when IMF and World Bank are trying to sell this idea of development, parallel at that time, you would come across Washington Consensus 1980s. More and more trade liberalization. So the idea of development as seen by West or the global North, they wanted a smooth, running of the system. And the dependency theorists, they were equally critical that look, the per capita of the West is piling up. On the other hand, the GDP of the global North is going down. In this context, now we'll see the role of World Bank, the idea of conditionality, and the idea of comparative advantage. These ideas were very much prevalent even before the collapse of Bretton Woods model. But the power of World Bank and IMF in the system was witnessed after the collapse of Bretton Woods model. So it's not so that these ideas of conditionality and comparative advantage was introduced in 70s or 80s. No, they were prevalent. Now, conditionality, there are three major points relating to this idea of conditionality. Conditionality and comparative advantage, both. Number one, the basic condition, of course, both the World Bank and IMF would provide you loans. World Bank would provide you development loan. IMF would pay off your deficits. That would automatically become your loan. You have to pay back. Loan, the most basic condition of any loan is markup, interest. So least developed countries and developing countries, they have no option because they need dollars. And that idea of markup, interest, reached up to the extent that there was no escape for least developed and developing countries. Let us assume a state A would go to World Bank with a feasibility report of construction of a dam with a rough cost estimate, let us assume, of 100 billion US dollars. Now, World Bank would not pay you $100 billion at all. What they would do, they would suggest you that, okay, fine, we will start this project, but we'll not give you $100 billion. Let's evaluate a comparative advantage. You would buy this X technology from this country, it's the most cheapest. You would buy this component from this country, you would buy this component from that company. And what do you think? How would a least developed or developing country would act? They are left with no option. Okay, fine. This idea of comparative advantage compelled lots and lots of developing countries to focus on one commodity, one item. Because these forums would provide the opportunity for that particular commodity to be sold out. This is very much correlated with the idea of economic dualism, not altogether, but very much related. So these aspects of conditionality and comparative advantage, it created further global disadvantages, not for developed world, but for developing world. We will try to figure out few disadvantages, because this idea of generating capita was an absolute failure when we view it from, or the narrative, we buy the narrative of those scholars who are critical towards the Western idea of development. Number one, food security of developing world was miserably, or the food insecurity can be witnessed in developing and least developed world. Now it's a very strange argument that the developing world and the least developed world, their backbone is agrarian. And how come they have the food insecurity? Yes, it was a food insecurity. I will suggest you to Google the idea of food security. It's about, not only about, it's not merely about production. It's also about access to food. It's also about nutrition. And most importantly, when third world countries or the least developed countries, they were told to focus on one commodity or two commodities, given the context that the comparative advantage, the philosophy of comparative advantage would serve you. So the farmers of least developed countries and developing countries, and even the economists of these territories, they buy this idea. Now what happened? That West, at that time, simultaneously and continuously subsidized its own agrarian setup. United States, now it's known to everyone that United States, during this whole idea of development and the global north and global south and the developing countries would focus on their cash crops, and the market would buy it, you would get dollars, and from that dollars you will buy finished form of products. But they were less buyers, because West didn't abandon the idea of subsidy of its own farmers. This is how it's resulted into food insecurity. The famines of Africa, one cannot generalize that the famines are merely because of absence of democracy, as Amrita Sen gave that idea. It's also because of the dualist strategy of the West. Secondly, now the more developing world would focus on its agriculture. They need seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, machinery. And it's the multinational companies of the global West, global North, which would provide that machinery, everything. So in a way, your imports would be high. So these ideas of conditionality and comparative advantage, they didn't serve properly. Then next one, of course, the corrupt leadership of developing world. One can also correlate it with the previous point of Cold War politics. Then the next one. Now this is very interesting. This whole idea of economic dualism coupled with the conditionality, coupled with comparative advantage, can only be successful, could be successful if the rates of the products would be equal or stable. Reality was that the cash crops and the primary products, which are the strength of developing and least developed countries, they are not expensive like the finished form products of the West. So if you are sending a unit of crop for $1, so you will not be getting a finished farm product in $1. Definitely that would be high. But given the scenario, as we have discussed earlier, that the high inflation rate and the low markup rate was a lucrative sign for least developed countries to buy this idea. But unfortunately, this idea flopped. And here comes IMF now, because pile up ho raha na ji, deficit. In late 80s, IMF rigorously applied this idea of structural adjustment. There was a fear, again, a fear which we have discussed earlier, that if the deficits would pile up in the same manner, so one day countries would become bankrupt. It would collapse whole of the capitalist system. One such example was Argentina. The external loans of Argentina piled up to 93 billion US dollars, and country defaulted. By the end of Cold War, the external loan of least developed countries was 1.4 trillion US dollars. 1,400 billion dollars. 1,400 billion dollars only to World Bank. We're not talking about other loans. So it's a very worrisome sign. What the decision makers or thinkers at IMF viewed, that such a scenario, such a crisis in a least developed country or the developing country is not because of our strategy. It's because of the fiscal deficit, the budgetary deficit of that country, where the expenditures are high and the national income is low. So IMF came up with this idea of structural adjustment program, directly challenging the sovereignty of such states by proposing budgetary cuts on education, healthcare, and other state expenditures. so that state expenditures would come down and within their revenue capacity. Not to provide subsidy to utilities. Now, the developing world was in a state of flux. Reason so that if you would not provide subsidies, so the purchasing power of the people is not up to an extent that they can buy those utilities, they can use those utilities. It would result into a further crisis within the state. The fact of the matter is that up till now, IMF buy this idea, sell this idea, sorry, of structural adjustment programs. In the case of Pakistan, whatever has been happening since last 6 to 7 months, you can correlate it with such a scheme. This government is opting for privatization of utilities, healthcare, nearly 400 departments. Although it would not result into to unemployment, but they are trying to shut down 400 departments so that they would definitely be जाहिर है budget तो कम होगा. Austerity measures have been carried out. Now the question arises that can a country develop through this scheme? Yes, we have examples like that of Singapore. Singapore paid back IMF loans up to the rate of 9%. But you need strong will. Anyways, that strong will and that aspect is not our topic of discussion for today. Our topic of discussion is that development is linked with flow of capita, and flow of capita can be in the form of goods, services, trade. Economic productivity is desirable for flow of capita. And what we have seen up till now, that this flow of capita, it's not inflow of capita, it's outflow of capita from least developed and developing countries. Are there any other mechanisms other than this Western idea of development, other than this strategy of World Bank, other than this strategy of IMF, other than this development thesis of UN, that is economic dualism? Are there any other mechanisms of flow of capital? So yes, there are other mechanisms, and that is number one, foreign aid. Foreign aid has also been an important source for inflow of capital, also known as official development assistance. Official development assistance. But some countries believe that when a donor country would provide you foreign aid, so it's also a phantom aid. Phantom aid means that it's also related or it is linked with certain conditions. In the Cold War, idea of foreign aid was used as an instrument of foreign policy by the both camps. Foreign aid, or you can say any other medium like foreign direct investment, may generate economic productivity, but it also creates an economic stagnation. Heavy dependency on foreign aid. Countries like Pakistan is a classical example of heavy reliance on foreign aid. One of the most important and classical manifestation in the post-Cold War era of this idea of official development assistance was Millennium Development Goal, whereby it was required that the developed countries would provide an aid up till 0.7% of their GNI, gross national income. Now make sure we have repeatedly used this word GNI. Gross national income is basically equal to your total GDP plus all the profits or the remittances or the inflow of capita in any form in your country minus your loan payment. So that would be your actual gross national income. So the global west or the developed countries would contribute to 0.7%. In the case of Millennium Development Goal, only Australia contributed, but that was not also up till 0.7, it was only 0.5. In the case of United States of America, it's near the bottom of this development assistance, 0.21% of the American GNI, 0.21. Expectation was up till 0.7. Another aspect that this idea of foreign aid, particularly during Cold War and even in some cases after Cold War, was devoid of any check and balance. So it resulted into corruption, malfunctioning, flight of capital. So foreign aid may be termed as a temporary arrangement, but it cannot replace the core, that is economic productivity of a society. That economic productivity which would generate such a flow of goods, services and money that the outflow would decrease and inflow would enhance, and that would be the time when you would step towards the process of, or you start your first step towards the process of development. So all this aspect, which we have, these aspects which I've discussed, have never ever created such a positive economic productivity For instance, that's the last argument, and then we'll go towards the contemporary context. At the time of immediately after World War II, the difference between GNI of Africa and Europe, sorry, Africa and uh, Europe, North America, Milake, the difference was 29 times GNI difference. And today it's 40 times. So the narrative of development as envisaged by West miserably failed. And here comes the China X factor in the contemporary context. We will develop you. We will not give you loan on high rates, only 2%. And even if you don't want loan, then we will start projects through idea of equal partnership. In the contemporary context, there is a marked shift. A new political economy of development has engulfed the whole developing and least developed countries. And interestingly, what the least developed countries and developing countries are doing, they have started buying the China X factor, the BRI factor, the AIIB factor, the BRI forum factor. Developing world is doing this, and the least developed world is doing the same thing which they did in 1970s, with the expectation, वही जो हमने पहले बात की थी, started taking huge loans. Since the narrative of development, since the author of development has changed from the West to Chinese, but the narrative of development is still the same. You would come across Chinese occupying ports because least developed countries have miserably failed to pay back their loans. There are high expectations associated with BRI. In the same way, the high expectations were there in 70s and 80s, that the inflation rate would remain high and the markup rates would remain low. लेकिन ऐसा नहीं हुआ. There is positive side as well, that at least the authors of development from the West, the way they sold their ideas didn't work. So let's give a chance to China. There is an infrastructural gap of 4 trillion to 8 trillion US dollars. And Chinese are willing to invest $900 million per year for the next 10 years. So let's give them a chance. 68 countries have signed agreements with Chinese. 152 countries across the globe are directly or indirectly associated with BRI Forum and AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So let's see what would happen. But the point is, the global inequality and poverty, whether the Chinese X factor would address them. Simultaneously, another X factor can be witnessed in 21st century, which was not prevalent in the previous years, or its contribution was very, minimal. And that was the rise of private aid in 21st century. International organizations, they are playing their part, but non-governmental organizations. So reportedly 38,000 non-governmental organizations across the globe. 38,000. Most important one in context of development, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Only in 2009, they donated $2.5 billion for global development projects. $2.5 billion only in 2009. There is not even a single year since 2009 that they have donated less than $1.75 billion. It's more than $1.7 billion per year. So let's see that how these new narratives of development, either they would pay off or not. Next presentation, or you can say this lecture, would be on the topic of gender and governance, and we'll try to study the essential idea of gender and governance, coupled with a few case studies of Asian belt. From the next Friday, we will be live from my channel, YouTube channel, and I will post the link of the channel. Subscribe that channel, and we'll see you over there. Thank you very much, Ji.